Iggy Pop never should have finished Soldier.
I'm a real leery of the fucking tube, you know, because I can get like...
Because when you tour, there's not too much else to do sometimes. Iggy Pop no longer watches soap operas. He's a rock and roll, non-parallel performer.
That was Iggy Pop in an interview back in 1983, plugging the album Zombie Birdhouse from the year before. The life of Jim Osterberg, better known as the stage name Iggy Pop, is one of true legend. Much has been said about his famed group The Stooges and of his Berlin period with David Bowie. But not nearly as many talk about the 1980s, and fewer yet about the album that kicked off the decade, Soldier. Few releases by the legendary Iggy Pop are more contentious than that of Soldier, his occasionally much-loved and equally much-hated album from 1980. A commercial failure, the album has been called uneven and sometimes plain silly, with a, quote, messy quality that led to it being, quote, met with relative indifference in terms of sales. All of this is true. It's not an easy album to digest, and the stories behind it are equally as tumultuous as any in the storied life of Iggy Pop. So why don't we dig in? Hi, I'm Andy Fenstermaker, host of Poetic Wax, a weekly music history series and podcast where I dig into the record collection I've been building since the 1990s and explore the sometimes little-told history of a band, an album, or even a song from within. As odd as it sounds, Soldier is probably the album that got me into Iggy Pop's solo work. It was songs like that snarky I'm a Conservative and the downtrodden Ambition, which has this slacker feel to it that goes head to head with 90s anthems like Smells Like Teen Spirit, Creep, and Loser. These tracks gripped me the moment I heard them, and while, yes, there's a messiness to the album, it all kind of works. In an article on No Ripcord, they say that with Soldier, Iggy Pop would, quote, unleash one of rock's great overlooked albums. This is the story of Soldier, or maybe better framed, the stories. And we have to start with that Berlin period. Iggy and Ziggy off the deep end. In the aftermath of the Stooges' second breakup, Iggy Pop was an absolute mess, but he still had a little juice left in him. Pairing with fellow ex-Stooges guitarist James Williamson, the pair recorded Kill City, which wouldn't see an official release until 1977. Already homeless and on the streets of LA, Pop was increasingly unstable, and he recognized this, which is saying a lot for Iggy Pop. He checked himself into a mental institution. Holed up at the UCLA Neuropsychiatric Institute, one of Iggy's only visitors was none other than David Bowie. Exiting the institution, he would join Bowie on his station-to-station tour. Together, the two would get arrested for possession in New York, and things continued to spiral. Bowie was in the midst of his Thin White Duke era, addled by his own cocaine addiction. Iggy in tow certainly didn't help the matter.
What I'm trying to do is to give back a little of what I've been lucky enough to get, which is still alive, thanks to a lot of other people.
Recognizing a change needed to be made, the pair jetted off to West Berlin in an attempt to clean up and lessen their respective addictions. Here, Bowie would create his legendary Berlin trilogy, consisting of Lows and Heroes in 1977 and Lodger from 1979. He would also help out Iggy with two masterpieces of his own, The Idiot and Lust for Life, both from 1977. Following that pair, Iggy would release TVI's 1977 Live, thus fulfilling his contractual obligations for his then label RCA Records. He would then sign with Arista, giving us New Values in 1979. The key single, I'm Bored, seemed to have a bit of clout to it, and he seemed on the rise as the 70s came to a close. It was in the second half of 1979 that Iggy landed in Wales to record Soldier. This Arista period is sometimes called the Arista era and sometimes called his New Wave era. As he landed in Wales, this collective mass of stars landed there with him. Rockfield Studios in Monmouth, Wales was the site of some truly iconic recordings over the years, from Queen's Bohemian Rhapsody to Oasis's What's the Story? Morning Glory. But when Iggy Pop rolled up to record Soldier in late 1979, the studio was about to host one of the strangest, most chaotic sessions in its storied history. The roster of contributors reads like a punk and post-rock fan's fever dream. Glen Matlock, ex-bassist for the Sex Pistols, and a key figure for crafting their sound, joined the project, bringing a melodic sensibility that stands in stark contrast to Iggy's raw delivery. James Williamson, the same guitarist who helped write and record Raw Power with the Stooges, contributed 2 early demos and was set to co-produce the record, but didn't stick around for the finished record. And we'll get to that soon. And speaking of producers, production on Soldier was ultimately helmed by Pat Moran, best known for working with artists like Queen, Robert Plant, and Rush. But Iggy's plan had also been to rope in David Bowie, who showed up at the studio and provided backing vocals for Play It Safe. However, their collaborative magic didn't fully ignite this time around, and Bowie quickly bailed, citing creative differences and a general dysfunction of the sessions. Kind of. We'll get to that one as well. Add to the mix a wild assortment of guest players. Steve New of Rich Kids fame, XTC's Barry Andrews, Ivan Kral from the Patti Smith Group, and even members of Simple Minds who were recording nearby at the same time. These were musicians from wildly different corners of the rock landscape, all converging to create what would be described as beautifully reckless by some and just reckless by others. And yes, reckless it was. The recording process at Rockfield was marked by infighting, bruised egos, some actual bruises, and a sense that no one was quite in charge. Stories from the sessions paint a picture of Iggy as a mad ringleader, which is no surprise as well, barely keeping the circus together.
It's up to each individual. Well, I usually work with people that are, everybody's a free agent, and we just all kind of fight it out. That's the way I work.
At one point, drummer Klaus Kruger threatened to walk off the project entirely after Iggy refused to let him use cymbals during recording. Yeah, you heard that right. Cymbals. No cymbals on an album? Well, other things would disappear, but we'll get to that soon as well. Through the chaos and through the circus, though, something strange and compelling emerged. The jagged energy of the sessions is backed by the album's DNA, for better or worse. Tracks like Loco Mosquito and Knocking Him Down in the City buzz with this loose, punky vibe, while Ambition reflects the slacker ethos that would dominate the 1990s. The Rockfield sessions may not have been smooth sailing, but they were undeniably Iggy. Messy, volatile, and somehow still magic and magnetic. A perfect reflection of the man behind the microphone. This is from Pop Matters. Instead of a punk masterpiece, however, Soldier turned out to be an uneven and sometimes plain silly recording. Tensions in the studio might have been a contributing factor. Legend has it that James Williamson and David Bowie were slated to co-produce the album, but clashed so badly that both walked out, while Iggy disliked Steve New so much that he omitted many of New's guitar parts from the final product. Whatever the reasons behind it, Soldier lacks musical muscle, although some creative ideas occasionally shine through. There were 3 notable bouts of infighting, each of which warrant a much deeper look. First was the rumored clash between James Williamson and David Bowie, and then there was an infamous fight between Steve New and Bowie, And finally, the fallout between Iggy and New. Let's start at the beginning. The rumored James Williamson-David Bowie clash. Now, there are mixed accounts of the clash between Williamson and Bowie. Originally, Iggy had hired Williamson to produce Soldier. Makes sense. I mean, Iggy had worked with Williamson for what seems like ages at this point, especially in the life of Iggy Pop. Kill City was still somewhat fresh, having finally been given a physical release in 1977. And he tapped Williamson to produce New Values as well. Williamson had run across David Bowie in the past too. For the Stooges' 1973 album, Raw Power, Bowie had been tapped to mix the album after either Columbia or Tony DeFries were dissatisfied with the original mix. Honestly, in truth, no one was happy with the original mix, and both Bowie and Iggy took a stab at mixing it. 30 years later, in an interview with Ken Shimamoto for I-94 Bar, Williamson would say the following. None of us liked Bowie's mix, but given everything, he didn't have a lot to work with. Bowie is not my favorite guy, but I have to say, overall, I think he did a pretty good job.
I wanted more musicality in it, and I couldn't find I tried everything. I tried listening to it nude. I thought maybe that'll help, Yeah, didn't help. So eventually we gave it to David Bowie and did a very sensible thing. Well, what are the salient bits? The guitar part and the vocal. And it was there and it was clear, but again, when it came out on vinyl, somebody should have mastered it hard, and they didn't.
He goes on to shed light on the supposed clash. Bowie just showed up to check it out and visit. He ended up doing background on one song, so he was never really involved other than to stir up Iggy. Jim and I had a falling out over the approach I was taking, very high-tech with 48-track recorders, etc., and the control I was commanding in the sessions, and I left after the basic tracks were done. So Williamson downplays the entire blow-up. Guitarist Steve New would chime in an interview with 3AM magazine. James Williamson, who was producing the original session, walked out. I was living with James at the Portobello Hotel. James would get up in the morning and drink half a bottle of vodka. He wore a suit and tie. They called him James Straight Williamson. He was a serious alcoholic. When Bowie turns up at Rockfield, James said, "I ain't working with him." I think it was over Bowie's mixing on Raw Power, but Jim, Iggy, was cool. I love Jim. If someone was arguing, he wouldn't side with anybody. Williamson would recount the following. I was not happy at all with a number of aspects of that record, including the band, the material, and the recording facilities, so I was unhappy in general, and vice versa. Sources seem to note it twofold. Williamson and Iggy clashed a bit on the tech aspect, and when Bowie swooped in with his own ideas, Williamson was out. According to a New Directions in Music article on Iggy Pop's Arista Trilogy by Marshall Bowden, quote, "It was all too much for Williamson, who flew into a rage at Bowie and at Iggy, quitting the project." Not only did Williamson walk out on Soldier, but he left the music industry entirely, enrolling in California State Polytechnic University in Pomona, receiving an electrical engineering degree in 1982, working first for Advanced Micro Devices before landing at Sony, where he'd work on various projects, including none other than the Blu-ray disc. It would be decades before Williamson returned to music. This brings us to the clash of Steve New and David Bowie. Steve New entered the picture in 1976 after answering an ad in the paper for a, quote, young guitarist no worse looking than Johnny Thunders. The ad was placed by Malcolm McLaren, seeking a new Sex Pistols guitarist after sensing that Steve Jones might leave. He auditioned New. Nothing came of the audition outside of a connection to the scene and perhaps, just as notably, befriending Sex Pistols bassist Glen Matlock. Here's a quote from New. "One night I was walking home past the 100 Club and all of a sudden Matlock appears, goes, 'All right, Steve, how you doing?' He's wearing this effing Anarchy shirt. He's like, why don't you come down and see us? We're playing here tonight. After that, Glen gets kicked out of the Pistols, and I bumped into Matlock again down King's Road. And he says, yeah, I'm putting a band together. I think I said to him, don't worry, I'll cut my hair. And that was the start of the Rich Kids. The Rich Kids struggled to land commercially, but New stuck with Matlock. So when Glen was tapped to work on Soldier, he asked New to join as well. New was a bit fascinated with Bowie, and the Rich Kids were produced by Mick Ronson, who had worked extensively with Bowie. Another quote from New: I was full of teenage anger at this guy who didn't answer any of my questions, referring to Bowie. I asked him all about Low and Heroes. I thought they were great albums. And Bowie's like, yeah, they're great albums. This irked the young Steve New, but the final straw was Bowie flirting with Patti Paladin. Paladin was the singer of female punk band Snatch. She'd go on to play in Flying Lizards as well. At the time, though, she was dating New. Here's New again. One day, Patti said, did you pick up on it? Bowie thinks he's gonna fuck me. This was the final straw. Patti tells me that. I open the door to my room. Bowie's walking up the stairs, so I fucking jumped on him. We both fell down the stairs. It was great. Ultimately, Bowie walked out as well. Or maybe he just finished what he came to contribute, which ended up just being the backing vocals on Play It Safe.
I wanna be a criminal, play it safe. Maybe we'll die together. I wanna be a criminal, play it safe. But if you wanna be safe.
The clash between Bowie and New had greater impact, which leads to New versus Pop. Pat Moran would step in to produce the album eventually. Iggy wasn't happy. Perhaps it was dissatisfaction with Steve New's performance, or maybe it was retribution for New's altercation with Bowie. Much of the lead guitar that New played was stripped from the final mix completely. This didn't sit well with Matlock, who, in Iggy Pop's biography, claimed that Iggy dropped it after the fight. The intense recording sessions and the sheer quantity of infighting and fallouts would lead to a lot of critics lambasting the release as subpar. Pop Matters would state the following, quote, Iggy's lyrics unfortunately do little to make up for the music, consistently failing as they do to match the cleverness and maturity of those on New Values. He desperately tries to sound rebellious, but his lyrics lack the smart wordplay of I'm bored or the venom of anything by the Stooges. End quote. Yet others disagree. That No Ripcord retrospective on Soldier says the lack of lead guitars gives, quote, the album an eerie and raw, yet catchy keyboard and acoustic sound throughout, a quality somewhat unique in the overall Iggy canon. And the songs are the most consistent in quality of any Iggy Pop album. My take is that, yes, it is indeed messy. There are songs I'm not too fond of here, but others I absolutely love. And just as much as those I love are the stories pulled from Soldier's historic, tumultuous recording. Almost as good as the story of the Stooges and the legend of the painted guitar. Might be a good one to check out next, you think? In the end, with the amount of infighting, with the drugs and the alcohol and the chaos, Soldier never should have been finished. It's kind of a miracle that it saw the light of day at all. Now, what do you think? Where does Soldier land in your favorites by Iggy Pop? I'd love to know. Let me know down in the comments. New videos drop every single week on YouTube, on podcast platforms, and anywhere else you decide you like to tune in. I'll see you in the next video.